because the majority of people operate in the materialistic viewpoint, including the medical profession. And so when you study the brain, for example, if you study it in that context, if you study it in terms of the way scientists who are materialists understand the brain, you'll hear them talk about where they think consciousness originates in the brain. Right? But from a non-dual perspective, and in terms of this work and the practices that we speak of here, consciousness doesn't originate in the brain. Yeah, the brain occurs in consciousness. And but the materialists, can't accept that, because there's no way that you can measure that, there's no way that you can perceive that other than the direct experience of it. And to me, I think that's ironic. Spiritual teachers like the Dalai Lama, when he meets with physicists and psychologists and psychiatrists and scientists about these matters, and he listens to them present the material perspective, he finds it hard not to laugh. And I understand that, because as far as I'm concerned, I think, and I don't think I'm a weirdo, I think it's well, maybe I am, but I think it's pretty easy to recognize the fact that, and I've said this many, many times here, it's very easy to recognize the fact that everything that is occurring is premised on there being awareness. I can't understand why that's not clear. Everything that's occurring is premised on there being awareness. Awareness is primal. Awareness is fundamental. And it is possible to literally directly experience your body, experience your entire body at the same time. That's possible. And if that's possible, it can only be possible because the body is occurring in awareness. If awareness was occurring in the body, right? If awareness was occurring in the body, the way it would occur would be different than the way it does occur. If we were actually looking, this is interesting if you consider it. If we were actually looking through these eyes, if awareness was back here in the brain, looking through these eyes, right? It would have to be a different experience than the one we're having, because the one we're having is one in which the only true reality is that awareness is there first, and what's occurring is occurring in awareness. So it's possible to even the idea that that awareness is somewhere behind the eyeballs in the brain, looking through the eyeballs, even that's occurring in awareness. If you take awareness away, everything that was happening is gone with it. It's the same thing as when we say, if you take the personality away, everything that comes with the personality goes with it, right? The trick is that if you take the personality away, what we mean by that is if you stop being the personality, then what was happening to you when you thought you were the personality is no longer happening to you, because you're not the personality. It's just happening. And what the spiritual teachers say is that at some point you want to get beyond the concepts, because what the scientists speak of is conceptual. It's the scientific version of things. And what the spiritual teachers teach is also conceptual. It's the spiritual, perception of things. But the spiritual teachers say there is more to it than that, and the scientists can't get more to it than that. They can't go beyond what they can do, in the ordinary way that things operate. But the spiritualists say you can get beyond the ordinary way that things happen by simply paying attention to your experience and recognizing that awareness is self-evident. when you really inquire into it, when you really look closely at it, it's apparent that awareness is self-evident, isn't it? I mean, does somebody have to explain to you that you're here? No, there's nothing more evident than that. But we don't have that experience of it because we have become conditioned and entranced in the version of life in which we're a body and we're a personality and so forth. And what happens is the brain and the mind continually keep interpreting what's happening that way. Continually keep interpreting what's happening without your having to be aware that it's happening. Continually keep interpreting what's happening. It's not just happening, but it's happening to me. And the only way it can continue to generate that it's happening to me is it also has to continue to generate the me that it's happening to. It has to, because if the me that it's happening to isn't real, that's got to be created along with what's happening, right? So what happens in the mind, the voice in your head is constantly doing a voiceover about everything that's happening, and it's saying what's happening, and then it's including with what's saying what's happening that it's happening to me. And that is such a constant operation, right, that you don't notice it. You don't notice it. But if you go to speak, you speak it. You speak from there. I was talking to somebody today about this, and the thing about it that gets confusing is even after you learn about these teachings and practices and you see the reality of these teachings and practices, and you have a certain degree of understanding about that, you can accept that when you inquire into what appears to be reality, that it fails, that it doesn't meet the test of reality. When you inquire into what is reality, that it doesn't meet the test of reality, it meets the test of being an appearance only. So the understandings can be there, right? And once the understandings are there sufficiently, then there is this process of being a seeker in which you're motivated now to have that not just be an understanding, but to have that be the way life is occurring for you, to have that be the way you're occurring for yourself. The problem with that is even after there's an understanding, the brain and the mind keep playing the same program. So somebody can have an understanding, and in the middle of a conversation, this happens here all the time, and I try and point it out. It's in the middle of in a conversation about the understanding, somebody will ask a question or say something, and when they ask the question or say something, they're speaking from the misunderstanding. That's how insidious it is. You know, on the one hand, I understand what you're saying. You could say, I understand this, I understand the concepts about it, and so forth. That's why Ramesh Valsakar makes such a big point out of the idea that you have to, first of all, make sure you understand the concept. So you have to learn how to listen for understanding. You have to learn how to listen for clarity. You have to learn how to listen with the sole intention of getting what is being said to you without distorting it. Then you have to come to a conclusion for yourself. Do I agree with this? Do I agree with this concept? Do I agree with these concepts? Do they make sense to me? Right?
So who's agreeing?
What's that?
Who is agreeing?
Well, in the end, I mean, this is a process. In the end of the process, right, there was never anybody there but consciousness. So as Rupert says, consciousness plays King Lear and John Smith.
So you're using consciousness and awareness as synonymous?
Yes. Yeah. And what I'm talking about, see, when I use consciousness and awareness synonymously, or when I talk about consciousness, or whatever word you want to use to talk about that, to talk about this, right? The most clear way to point to it is to say this, to talk about this. Why? Because this is it. What's happening all the time is it, right? And whatever that is, whatever this is, right? It's clear that we're sharing it, isn't it? It's clear that we're sharing it. You know, that whatever this is that I'm referring to, you can look for yourself and see it for yourself as well, and see that what I'm referring to is something that you can see as well for yourself. So there's a process that has to be gone through, in which you can tolerate the consistent resistance, and you can tolerate the consistent attempt by the mind and the brain to continue to generate the same reality. That requires tolerance, right? Because it's disturbing. It's a disturbing experience to have, isn't it? You know, to think everything was one way, then to get some information to say, well, not exactly, and then to get more information that says, it's not at all like that. It's not at all like that. It's the opposite of what you thought it was. So you're getting this information, and you're grasping this information, and you're understanding this information, right? But at the same time that's happening, the brain and the consciousness and the program that's generating the listening to the message, right, is discovering its own fraudulent existence. Do you see the problem? It's discovering its own fraudulent existence. Well, that creates a problem now, because this is all I ever knew myself to be, and now I have information coming in saying that that's not real and that's not who I am. But this is all I ever knew myself to be. And if that information is true, right, then who I have considered myself to be will only let go of its claim and its hold on me, right, if it feels satisfied and comfortable that it's going to stay in existence, right? Yeah, it's only going to let go of the hold that it has on you if it feels satisfied and comfortable that it's going to stay in existence. That's why Ramesh Balsekar came up with the way that he teaches. Because what he says is, I came up with a way to talk your ego into being enlightened. I came up with a way to talk your ego into being enlightened. In other words, you don't have to worry. You don't have to feel threatened. You're going to stay. We're not going to kill the ego. The ego is going to stay. You know, people who believe that you can kill the ego were naive in the first place. It's necessary. The ego is a necessary reality. So we're not going to kill the ego. The ego can stay. But now we're going to educate the ego to understand and to realize that if the ego is willing to give up its misunderstanding about itself as a doer, this is what Ramesh came up with. If the ego is willing to give up its understanding of itself as a doer, that it can get what it really wants, which is peace, right? If it's willing to give up its understanding of itself as a doer, if it's willing to give up its understanding of time, it can still be here and it will have peace. The ego can have peace. Why? Because if these understandings are given up for the truth, you realize that you are not in conflict with any other human being, and you're not in conflict with life itself. So how can there not be peace? If there's no free will, it means that I never intentionally do anything that has an effect on other people, nor do they intentionally or consciously have an ability to do anything to harm me. So that takes all that off the table. Then it also takes off the table the whole psychological realm of suffering, in terms of whatever who I thought I was, thought it did in the past that was wrong, and therefore I carry guilt, and therefore I carry shame, and therefore I carry the stress and the burden of having that personal history, right? That all gets wiped away, because if there's no free will and there's no actor, none of that's true. It's just not true. And then the same thing applies now. Whatever I'm doing now, if I see it for what it really is, if I understand the truth, it's the source. Thy will be done. I am not doing it. It's the source that's doing it. And the same thing is going to apply to the future. So the ego can be educated to understand there's a way the ego can continue to exist, right? But get what it really wants. That's why when Ramesh interacts with people, he says to them, what do you want? He knows who he's talking to. He's talking to the ego. What do you really want as an ego? What do you really want? And when he goes through a process with people to interact about that, they always end up at the same place. What do you want? It's always the same thing. I want an experience. What's that experience that I want? I want the experience of being happy. I want the experience of being peaceful. I want the experience of clarity. I want the experience of love. It's always those words. It's always those words, right? And one of the things that Ramesh Balsekar discovered out of his relationship with his guru is that once you experience that, which he did, he experienced self-realization through his relationship with Nisargadatta, his guru. But what he did was something different than his guru did. His guru just stayed with that and just kept speaking about that to people. No. But what he did is he did something different. He said, I can see the problem. I can see that you can get that who you really are is not who you think you are. You can get that you're really the awareness itself. Right? I can see the problem. But if you get that that's who you really are, getting that will simultaneously stir up a huge defensive reaction with the ego. Right? Because getting who you really are involves realizing what you're not, which is realizing that you're not the personality, you're not the body, and you're not the ego. That's who the brain thinks you are. Therefore, it will consider itself under threat. It will consider itself being attacked. And then it will produce all of the confusion. Because, if you really think about it, right? What I'm talking about here, and all of you have been around here long enough to have heard this again and again in many different versions, have you not? Yes. Yeah, and it could be contained in a one-page statement, couldn't it? I mean, that's pretty much what Ramana Maharshi did. He gave a very brief thing that said simply, this is what this is, right? So it's not that complicated. The concepts are not complicated. The concepts are relatively simple, right? What's complicated is what happens when the listener that hears the concepts tries to apply them and tries to accept them. Then that's the complication. That's when you get confused. That's when the mind will start to do stuff with it and do stuff in terms of your emotions and do stuff in terms of your body, that will turn this into something that it's actually not, in terms of making it seem very complicated, very difficult, very obscure, very, magical somehow, right? But it really isn't. That's what the mind's doing to resist it. Do you understand that? This is very important. That's what the mind's doing to try and resist it, to try and ward it off, to try and keep from allowing it in. Because the way the mind is organized is, in order to be realized, in order to be enlightened, that the ego has to be seen as not real, and the ego has to be dismissed in terms of its existence. And so that creates a lot of trouble. That creates a lot of problems, right? And what Ramesh Balsekar said is that doesn't have to be the case. The ego can be invited to join in the process. The ego can be invited to join in the process. And the reason that works more than anything else, right, other than the fact that it's going to help the ego to relax and not fight and not resist, right? But the reason that this approach is more useful is because it's coming from a non-threatening point of view, in the sense that even the ego is the self. Do you understand? This approach is operating from the understanding that the ego may think it's separate from God, but I know that it's not separate from God, right? So that gives me an ability to interact with the ego in such a way where I can include the ego. The ego doesn't have to change. The ego doesn't have to go anywhere. Why? Because I know that the truth is that there only is consciousness. It doesn't even have to submit. It doesn't even have to submit, because what the teaching is telling the ego, right, that you can still maintain your domination in this realm, right? But you can get what you really want in terms of realizing that you can let go of the reins, so to speak. You can take your hands off the steering wheel and everything will be fine, because it was never you. to get the ego to understand that, now the ego is like, oh, this is great. I can be in charge, but be completely relaxed and be at peace and feel content and satisfied, because the truth is I was never in charge. But I could still play me in the movie. I know who I really am now, but I can still play me in the movie. And that person that I'm playing in the movie is going to be a person who is in charge, is going to be a person who is playing with the laws of the reality that we all live in, right? And that brings you back into time, it brings you back into accomplishing things, it brings you back into experiencing things as a separate person, right? And none of that's a problem now, because you understand that's just an appearance. And that the ego is the self. Ultimately, if you succeed in talking the ego into releasing its grip on you, if you succeed in talking the ego into relaxing, right, there will be an enlightenment of the ego. The ego will become an enlightened ego. In other words, the ego will know that it's an ego, and it will know that it doesn't have a separate existence, right, and that it is God. And that's an enlightened ego. And when there's an enlightened ego, the ego's not threatened anymore. It falls into a natural state in which it's not threatened anymore. You can't do anything to hurt it, because it knows the truth about itself. It knows that it can't be hurt. And so what happens? You go back to what it says in the summary in the beginning of the Course of Miracles, right? What is real cannot be threatened. The ego learns what is real cannot be threatened.
So it can be empowered once it
knows. Exactly. Of course, this is all an illusion, because the only real power is the power of God.
Right.
Yeah. But see, the ego can learn that and become an enlightened ego, where it can continue to act as if it's the doer, but knows that it never did anything. You know, I mean, isn't fake it until you make it the way the reality works? I mean, that's why we have the laws and the 10 Commandments and all that stuff. So you can act moral until you are moral. Right? And until you are moral, the way we'll get you to act moral is we'll threaten you. If you don't act moral, we'll punish you. Right? But that's not true morality. True morality is you're moral and you behave yourself, right, because you know the truth. That's true morality. You behave yourself because you understand that what goes around comes around. You behave yourself because you know there's nowhere to hide. There's nothing you will ever do that will not be known. There was nothing that you will ever do that will not be known, and there's nothing that you will ever do, right, that can escape the larger picture of the truth. So it's really an opportunity to experience, as Ramesh said before he died, you know, that his life had become a matter of simply enjoying himself, experiencing the peace that became available when he realized that he wasn't in conflict with anything. Wasn't in conflict with any human being, wasn't in conflict with the world, wasn't in conflict with his mind, wasn't in conflict with the situations that occurred. And ultimately, the reason he wasn't in conflict with any of that is because him and that were seen to be one thing, non-dual. How can I have conflict with something that I am? I mean, if you really, you know, I've been kind of pointing to this a little bit in the last couple of talks. How can you have conflict with something that you are? If you really ponder that, right, you might notice that it's not possible to have conflict with something that you are. You have to be separate from that first. Do you understand that? Does that make sense? That's non-dual. That's what non-duality is all about. How can you have conflict with what you are? There's nothing other than what you are. There's nothing outside of that to have a position. There's nothing outside of that to have an argument, you know, to have an assessment, to have a judgment about what's going on. There's nothing outside of it to do that.